Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. New leaks continue to expose a cover-up by the OPCW, the world's top chemical weapons watchdog, over a critical event in Syria. Documents, emails, and testimony from OPCW officials have raised major doubts about the allegation that the Syrian government committed a chemical weapons attack in the city of Douma in April 2018. The leaked OPCW information has been released in pieces by WikiLeaks. The latest documents contain a number of significant revelations, including that about 20 OPCW officials voiced concerns to their superiors that their scientific findings and on-the-ground evidence was suppressed and excluded. This is, without a doubt, a major global scandal. The OPCW, under reported U.S. pressure, suppressing vital evidence about allegations of chemical weapons in Syria. But that very fact exposes another global scandal. With the exception of small outlets like the Grayzone, the mass media has widely ignored or whitewashed this story. And this widespread censorship of the OPCW scandal has just led one journalist to resign. Up until recently, Tarek Haddad was a reporter at Newsweek. But in early December, Tarek announced that he had quit his position after Newsweek refused to publish his story about the OPCW cover-up. In a lengthy piece explaining his decision, Tarek writes, quote, "On one hand, I could continue to be employed by the company, stay in their chic London offices, and earn a steady salary, only if I adhered to what could or could not be reported and suppressed vital facts. Alternatively, I could leave the company and tell the truth." Well, Tarek Haddad, he joins me now. Tarek Haddad, welcome to Pushback. Talk to us about what prompted your decision to resign and the events that led up to it.
Sure, and thank you for having me on. Yeah, basically, like I detail in my piece, I wasn't kind of going into this situation with any kind of, intentions of, making a big controversy. Just doing my job as a news reporter. The situation in Syria starts to pick up again, and then alleged white phosphorus use by Turkey. So, I'm starting to look at things going on with the OPCW as they're the body that is, supposed to be investigating attacks such as those. And so it's just kind of snowballed out of there. I kept finding more and more information that, to me, this was an undeniably big news story. And everything in my gut was, there's something that needs to be printed about this. I raised it with my editors, and then got knocked back more and more. And then with time, it became clear that it wasn't because my evidence wasn't good enough. It was purely on this story is not something that's in our interests to publish to our readers. So that was essentially it, really.
You write in your piece, quote, "The U.S. government, in an ugly alliance with those who profit the most from war, has its tentacles in every part of the media. Imposters with ties to the U.S. State Department sit in newsrooms all over the world. Editors with no apparent connections to the members club have done nothing to resist. Together, they filter out what can or cannot be reported. Inconvenient stories are completely blocked. As a result, journalism is quickly dying. America is regressing because it lacks the truth." So talk to us about that, Tarek, and how you experience that in the newsroom, that dynamic in the newsroom, especially when it comes to reliance on sources with ties to war profiteers and Western governments themselves.
Sure. Well, I guess there'll be sort of two different parts to that question, but I guess so. One aspect is the editors that have links to these organizations such as the Council on Foreign Relations. And so, for example, in my time as working as a journalist, I was never aware of any kind of connection between journalism and the Council on Foreign Relations. And so that's kind of was my first ever real experience of it. And I, say this in the piece because some people might think that I'm, being naive. And of course, they have a massive influence on journalism, and it's been going for years. And that might be the case, but it was the first time I experienced it, and it was not something that I thought was appropriate for a newsroom. I've been in multiple newsrooms, and someone who's been very big on kind of the history of journalism and the ethics of journalism, and to me that just seemed like a complete flagrant violation of everything that journalism stands for, to have people that attend programs funded by the State Department, and they're making these connections with people in the State Department, and then when I was presented with kind of the evidence that I experienced, it kind of confirmed my my feelings about that. And then so the second part would be about the reliance on organisations like Belencat, which other journalists have taken the time to show that they're not who they purport to be. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done around that, because I think my understanding from the public is that a lot of people still seem to trust them, and just a kind of one tweet from them will be enough for an average reader that's not that's not taking the time to delve into these issues. It's usually enough for them to be, okay, this is an issue that I can ignore now. So I think that's another vital aspect, because it's a very new development of of propaganda that's not really been seen before Syria. So
Yeah, well,
I mean,
Tarek, let me just explain for people who aren't familiar with Belencat, because it's very important. Belencat is an organization of so-called citizen journalists using open source data that has become very prominent in recent years, and now they're relied on by the media in several major stories, especially when it comes to stories that accuse Russia or Syria of nefarious acts like a chemical weapons attack, and they've become to be used as a source. And even though their founder, for example, Eliot Higgins, I'll read you a quote. This is from the New York Times, where they acknowledge that they don't even have a scientific background. I'll read this to you. Mr.
or
Higgins,
journalism background.
right. But I'll read you a quote from the New York Times, for example, talking about the founder of Belencat, Eliot Higgins. It says, quote, Mr. Higgins attributed his skill not to any special knowledge of international conflicts or digital data, but to the hours he had spent playing video games, which he said gave him the idea that any mystery can be cracked. Unquote. That's an actual quote from the New York Times, and somehow that's deemed to be a boost to them, and not shining a light on just how weak their credentials are. The very fact that they're playing video games and citing that as reason why, as how they've honed their craft. And what is also concealed in how the mainstream media cites Belencat is that Belencat receives funding from the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a U.S. government body and has been used to advance regime change goals around the world. Eliot Higgins himself is a fellow at the Atlantic Council, which is funded by all sorts of governments, including the U.S., Britain, and members of NATO and the Gulf states. And yet they're used and cited often as experts. And what's interesting about this OPCW scandal is there has been a lot of concern that, in fact, the OPCW, in ignoring its own scientists and sidelining them, that they relied on Belencat. And because a lot of the findings that were in some final OPCW reports have mirrored Belencat's. And there's a reference in the suppressed engineering report, the one that the public was not meant to see. We can talk more about that. But this engineering expert at the OPCW, the one which concludes that actually he thinks that most likely the gas cylinders found at the scene in Douma were manually placed and not dropped from the air. But that expert, his report refers to, quote, supposed experts who the OPCW consulted. And that has been their speculation that those supposed experts, that this actual expert is referring to, is Belencat.
Right. And I guess that would mirror a similar trend that we saw with MH17, which I can't remember the US official that said so, but I think if you look on my Twitter, there's an article recently from kind of describing the history of Belencat, but US officials directly kind of almost thank Belencat for their investigative work in determining their results. So I think it's part of this very kind of nefarious strategy of saying, it's almost, you're praising Belencat and then they're accepting their results unquestioningly, and then people who differ from that narrative get silenced, and that's why we have this situation that we have at the moment, where genuine scientists with no real political interest. I've talked to some people in this industry when I was researching previous articles. Most of them aren't really political. They're engineers or so on, and they understand the gravitas of their job. They understand that their job isn't to be political. It's to just do their best job they can as scientists, and then let the dust falls where it does afterwards. So, and I think that's why it's such an important story as well, because it's so dangerous to politicize a body that like this. These bodies were put in place for very, very important reasons, and to avoid devastating attacks against human beings that shouldn't be kind of going on in this day and age. And if we start to politicize them and we undermine their authority, then it's very dangerous, I think, and that should go without saying.
And since you referred to it, just let me explain what MH17 is for anybody who doesn't know. That is the downing of Malaysia Airlines flight 17 that occurred in the summer of 2014. And Belencat was among the groups that accused or pointed the finger at Russian-backed separatists in Ukraine as having carried out that attack. But of course, that conclusion of Belencat's, like many others, has come under question. But tell us more about your struggles internally at Newsweek, and your efforts to try to resolve whatever objections you faced in trying to cover this story about the OPCW scandal in Syria.
Sure. So kind of it started off no different than any other news story that I would pitch. We have a messaging system called Slack, which I think a lot of people are familiar with. But first I raised it with one of my editors, Alfred Joyner, and he didn't seem to be particularly opposed to the story, but he's not. He doesn't have particular expertise in foreign affairs or anything like that. So it was automatically. I was told to write a note to him and Demi Ryder, which is our foreign affairs editor at Newsweek. I sent a longish note with links, various documents to support what was going on. Interestingly, almost kind of 5 minutes after I sent the note, I kind of wasn't expecting a response immediately. And I was just walking to get a cup of coffee, and immediately, I could start to see attempts to kind of not, to cast doubt over the story. But it was the kind of stuff it's not addressing the actual facts. It's kind of, the publication itself, where these things come from, that's a little bit suspect, even though it was the Mail on Sunday. I understand for political reasons, some people might disapprove of the politics of the Mail on Sunday. They tend to be more right wing in the United Kingdom, but journalists trained in the United Kingdom will know that the Mail on Sunday still has very good journalists, and they exposed the 2005 MP's expenses scandal, for example. So it's not like they're incapable of doing real journalism. And then I had people have raised doubts about Peter Hitchens, who's the person that wrote the Mail on Sunday piece. And because he's kind of spent the last few years as an opinion columnist. But again, I kind of went to great lengths to try and explain, listen, I understand his recent history and why he might be controversial to some figures. but he has a very, very long, reporting career. Was Washington bureau and a Moscow bureau for about 20 years. And he takes the time in his reporting to kind of to show how everything's been done and verified, and there's been kind of blog posts to the side that have documented how he's met with one of the OPCW scientists in a safe house in Europe. So it was kind of, my immediate feeling is that the facts of what I was presenting weren't being discussed. It was attacking the sources or who it's coming from. And then when I kept pushing, essentially it turned into a character attack of me. And that was, the moment that I became very kind of upset and essentially decided to resign because kind of without being overconfident in my abilities or egotistical or anything of that nature, but throughout my reporting career, I've never really had any issues of editors not getting on with me or saying that my sources are not very good or anything like that. And that's, even though I understand the piece I've written may be very difficult and long for people to get through, I just really wanted to explain that I have this journalism background. I've never had any issues before. It was only when I was starting to raise questions about things that the US government essentially wouldn't want answered that I started having these character attacks. And it did feel pretty much like bullying into, just be quiet, do the kind of reporting we want you to do, and don't question us if we say that you can't run this story. And this is kind of, it was funny because at the time, I'm not sure if you're familiar, we had the firing of a reporter who kind of ran this story that turned out to be wrong about Donald Trump a week before. So she quit because she said Donald Trump was, what's Donald Trump doing on Thanksgiving? He's going to be tweeting, golfing, and more. Turns out he makes a visit to Afghanistan. And, at the time, this was actually happening all at the same time as the OPCW thing. At the time, we were having lots of team meetings, and the editors are saying, I understand if you guys are concerned, please come and talk to us. We're always here to have questions. If you have questions on a story, feel free to question our judgment. That kind, those kind of messages. And at the same time, I was going to the editors. I was raising some of my concerns, and essentially they refused to speak to me. I made 3 attempts to speak to Laura Davis, the London editor, and I was getting, increasingly more stressed because I thought it was a very important story, and I was getting this criticism at the time from the editors, and I really just wanted to talk to her in person to share my concerns and discuss why I thought it was an important story. And then the next thing I know, I receive an email, that's fairly long, just listing out criticisms. So that was when I knew it wasn't, this wasn't on rational debate or something wrong with the facts or the facts not matching up. There was an ulterior motive here.
And so talk to us then about your decision to resign, and did you think through what the consequences were of quitting this position and how this would impact your ability to find another position in a media industry where obviously jobs are already very scarce and hard to find?
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, to be honest, if I don't find another position in journalism because of this, I'm perfectly happy to accept that consequence. I mean, it's not desirable, but there is no way I could have continued in that job, knowing that I'd have to, that I couldn't report something like this. It was actually I remember so I was thinking about resigning for about a week. In that time that I was collecting evidence and I was hoping to talk to Laura, but when I received that email that kind of was essentially a character attack, the decision became very easy because it clarified everything for me. And to be honest, I don't regret it at all. I still don't know where the chips are going to fall essentially from here, but so far the feedback from everyone's been fantastic. The support from the internet has been really great. I'm very thankful to people that have said kind things to me, and thankfully, there's been very, very little negative. There's been a few, the kind of the usual people that you would expect, the Eliot Higgins and what's his name, Dave Lucas, I think, or some. But you know, that's nothing to me. It's I don't really take what they say seriously, and I don't think other people on the internet should anymore. We kind of know who they are, and I think people that's kind of get into these long Twitter tirades with them it's kind of going to be a waste of your time. You know what their job is to do. They're not going to change their minds on the internet. That's not what they're there for. They have a specific purpose, I think.
What to you would be the best outcome of your ordeal here, of what you went through, your choosing to resign, and you choosing to come forward to tell your story?
So I think a couple of things. One thing I tried to do is keep in mind other journalists when I was writing this. Even though I'm not aware of any other journalists in a similar position, I'm definitely sure that I can't be the only one. I mean, the amount of evidence that there is at the moment kind of surrounding these OPCW leaks is growing by the day. It's becoming harder and harder for any serious journalist to kind of look at the evidence and, continue with the same thing. So I think one ideal scenario would be that other journalists start to push the issue with their respective organizations. And, hopefully we do start seeing some coverage. Even though I'm very critical of Newsweek in the piece that I've written, I think what happened to me could have happened at any publication in the West, except a very few. So I think, yeah, that's one thing. Hopefully, other journalists will start to speak up. More long term, I mean, I don't know if this is very naive, but I'd love to see the influence of the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, have that journalists say, no, actually, you have a conflict of interest. You don't have a place in a newsroom. There is no space for you. You have you can't do your job adequately to hold the government to account. That's the journalists, one of the journalists' main priorities. If you have this conflict of interest, sorry, it makes you not applicable to be a journalist. And then I guess finally, just to greater public awareness about how propaganda works. And it's not just Belencat. I think there's a lot of evidence to say that white helmets as well is propaganda. And that might have been a controversial thing to say a few years ago, but I think now it's, the evidence is there that it's beyond doubt that it's government propaganda. And I think people just slowly need to get more awareness about that out.
Well, Tarek, I, for one, am one of the many who really appreciates what you've done here. It takes a lot to not just speak out about Syria, which I think is actually brave in itself, given all the smear attacks that one faces. But in your case, you risked your job over it, and you lost your job over it, and you resigned in a very principled move. And so, I, for one, hope that your integrity and your courage will resonate and inspire other media outlets and journalists to display that same integrity and courage that you've shown here. And I hope that it will, because this is often how whistleblowing works and how truth-telling works, is it takes one brave person to set a chain in motion. And I really hope that that is what happens here.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, that's all I can hope for, really. I had parents and stuff on the phone, and various people that I've worked with through the years. Some of which are have experience of these things, and a lot of people kind of actually told me not to do this. Some people worried for my safety. Obviously, my parents were a little bit concerned. Given that kind of it's not out of the ordinary for kind of nefarious things to happen in these situations. But I think it was the important, it was the right thing to do, and I don't have any regrets. And hopefully, more and more people can start to talk about it. I think there are a lot of good journalists out there. The evidence is there. it's, they, and I'm sure there's definitely other people that are feeling frustrated. So hopefully I've given them the template of how they can approach editors and how they can raise stories and how they can push back if they are kind of, their stories are declined. And hopefully that's a trend.
I hope so too. Tarek Haddad is a journalist, up until recently a reporter at Newsweek, and his website is Tarek Haddad, and we'll link to his piece where he breaks down his reporting process about this Syria OPCW scandal and what led him to resign from Newsweek. Tarek, thanks very much.
Thank you very much for having me.